You don't get to decide who deserves respect just because you have money. The words cut clean through the low hum of polished conversations, sharper than the clink of crystal glasses and the soft jazz drifting through the upscale Manhattan dining room. And for a split second, everything seemed to pause, as if the entire restaurant had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe, because no one, absolutely no one, talked like that here, not to someone who looked like him. Not in a place where a single steak cost more than a week's rent in Brooklyn, but Sophie Carter didn't seem to notice the shift in the room. Or maybe she did and simply chose not to care, standing there in her simple black uniform, her name tag slightly crooked, her hair pulled back just a little too tight, like she was holding her whole life together the same way, her hand still wrapped around the notepad she had been using seconds ago, her chest rising and falling just a bit faster than usual, but her eyes steady, locked on the man in front of her like she had nothing to lose, because maybe she didn't. Not anymore. Not after everything. And the man, Ethan, though no one here knew his name yet, stood there in a worn coat that didn't quite fit the room, his shoes carrying the faint dust of streets rather than polished marble floors, his expression calm, almost too calm, like he was observing something far more interesting than a simple argument, like this moment mattered in a way the others around them couldn't understand. And across from him, a sharply dressed customer scoffed, his voice dripping with entitlement as he gestured dismissively, insisting the man didn't belong here, that some people should know their place, that rules existed for a reason, and Sophie's jaw tightened just enough to show she had heard it all before, not just tonight, not just here, but everywhere, in every job, in every quiet dismissal she had learned to swallow until she decided she wouldn't anymore. And when she spoke again, her voice didn't rise, didn't tremble, didn't apologize, it simply held, firm and unwavering, as she pointed out the mistake on the bill, the overcharge, the assumption, the way fairness had been conveniently ignored until it benefited someone with influence. And around them, heads turned, whispers spread, a few people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, as if watching something they weren't sure they should witness, because this wasn't just about a receipt anymore. It wasn't even about the man in front of her. It was about something deeper, something that didn't belong in a place like this, but had found its way in anyway. And Ethan watched her, really watched her, not the uniform, not the worn edges of her sleeves, not the way she clearly didn't belong in this world of tailored suits and quiet deals, but the way she stood her ground when it would have been easier, smarter even, to step back, to apologize, to keep her job safe, to keep her head down like everyone else. And for the first time that night, a faint, almost invisible smile touched the corner of his lips, not because of the argument itself, but because of what it revealed, something rare, something real, something that couldn't be bought or trained or rehearsed. And as the tension lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break, Sophie took a small breath, squared her shoulders, and said one last time, quieter now, but somehow stronger, right is right, even if you stand alone. And this time, no one laughed. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a thread being pulled from a perfectly woven fabric. And then the manager's voice cut through it, tight and controlled, the kind of voice that smiled for customers but sharpened behind closed doors. Sophie. A word. And she knew that tone. She had heard it before, the warning hidden beneath politeness, the kind that meant consequences were already waiting. And still she did not look away immediately, her eyes lingering for half a second longer on the man in the worn coat, as if making sure he was not about to be dismissed again, as if confirming that at least for this moment, he had been treated fairly. And then she turned, following the manager toward the edge of the dining room, where the lights felt colder and the conversations quieter, where judgment did not need to be whispered because it was understood. And the moment they stepped out of the main floor, the smile disappeared, replaced by something sharper. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he asked, his voice low but pressing, and Sophie exhaled slowly, not defensive, not apologetic, just steady. "I corrected a mistake," she said, and that answer did not help. It only made his expression tighten further, because this was not about the bill, and they both knew it. "You embarrassed a paying customer," he replied, each word measured. "In a place like this, perception matters." And there it was, the real rule, not fairness, not truth, but perception. and Sophie felt that familiar weight press against her chest. The quiet calculation she had learned to make in moments like this. Rent due in 4 days. The notice folded on her kitchen counter. The text message from her landlord she had not answered yet. The second job she had already been late to twice this week. Everything balancing on a thin line that could snap with one wrong move. And for a second, just 1 second, she considered saying it. The simple apology that would smooth everything over. The words that would cost her nothing in this room, but everything somewhere deeper. And her fingers tightened slightly around her notepad before she let out a breath and met his eyes again. He was right, she said quietly. The charge was wrong. And the manager stared at her as if waiting for something else, something softer, something safer. But it did not come, and after a long pause, he shook his head. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. You are on thin ice, Sophie, he said. One more situation like that, and we will have to reconsider your position here. And she nodded, not because she agreed, but because she understood the reality of it, the unspoken rules of a world that rewarded silence more than honesty. And as she stepped back onto the floor, the warmth of the restaurant felt different now, heavier somehow, the glances lingering a little longer, the whispers, softer but sharper, and she moved through it anyway, picking up trays, refilling glasses, doing her job with the same quiet precision as before, because survival did not pause for pride. And across the room, at a table near the back, the man in the worn coat had not left. He sat there still, untouched glass of water in front of him, his gaze following her not in a way that felt intrusive, but thoughtful, measured, like he was seeing something most people overlooked. And when their eyes met again, just for a brief second, he gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to say that he had heard her, that what she did had mattered. And Sophie looked away first, not because she was unsure, but because she could not afford to be, not tonight, not with everything waiting for her outside those polished glass doors, where the city did not care about who was right, only who could keep going. By the time the dinner rush began to thin and the golden glow of the restaurant softened into something quieter, something more reflective, Sophie's feet ached in that familiar, dull way that came from standing too long in shoes that were never meant for 12-hour shifts. But she kept moving anyway, clearing plates, stacking glasses, nodding politely to customers who barely noticed her, because invisibility was part of the job, until it was not, and then it became a problem, and tonight had already crossed that line. And still, she worked as if nothing had happened, because that was how you survived. You kept going until the world either pushed you out or let you stay. And somewhere between refilling a water glass and wiping down a table near the back, she noticed him again, still there, still seated in the same place, the untouched water now half gone, the worn coat draped loosely over the back of his chair. And for a brief second she hesitated, not because she needed to, but because something about him did not fit the pattern of everyone else who came through these doors. He was not impatient, not entitled, not trying to be seen. He simply watched, like he was waiting for something that had not happened yet. And before she could second-guess herself, she walked over, notepad in hand out of habit more than necessity. "Are you ready to order?" she asked, her tone neutral but not cold, professional but not distant. And he looked up, meeting her gaze with that same quiet focus. "I think I already got what I came for," he said, and the answer caught her off guard just enough to show in the smallest flicker of her expression, because it was not the kind of response she was trained for, not something that fit neatly into the script she followed every night. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them holding something unspoken, something neither rushed to fill, until she shifted slightly, grounding herself back into the reality she knew. "Well, if you change your mind, the kitchen is still open for another hour," she replied, her voice steady again. And he nodded, but did not look away this time. "You stood your ground back there," he said after a second, not loud, not dramatic, just a simple observation, but it landed heavier than any compliment she had heard in a long time, because it acknowledged something deeper than service or politeness. It acknowledged choice. And Sophie let out a small breath she did not realize she had been holding, her fingers lightly tapping against the edge of her notepad. "Someone had to," she answered, and there was no pride in her tone, just truth. And he studied her for a moment longer, as if weighing something. as if deciding how much to reveal and how much to keep hidden. And then he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet, the kind that looked ordinary enough until you noticed the details, the stitching, the weight of it, the subtle difference that hinted at something more. But Sophie did not look closely. She had learned not to, because assumptions had a way of leading people in the wrong direction. And he placed a few bills on the table, more than enough for a meal he had not ordered, more than what most would leave even after a full dinner. And she glanced at it briefly before shaking her head, sliding the money back toward him with a small, firm motion. "You do not have to do that," she said. "You did not order anything." And for the first time, something shifted in his expression, something almost like surprise, not because of the refusal itself, but because of how easily it came, how natural it was for her to reject something that would have made her night easier, her week easier, maybe even her situation outside these walls a little less heavy. And he did not argue, did not insist. He simply looked at her, really looked at her, and asked quietly, "Why?" And Sophie met his gaze without hesitation, her answer coming just as simply, just as firmly as before. "Because right is right," she said, echoing her own words from earlier, not realizing that they had already begun to settle somewhere deeper than she intended, somewhere that would not let them be forgotten. And for a brief second, the noise of the restaurant faded again, the world narrowing to that single exchange, that single moment where something small, almost invisible, had just changed everything, even if neither of them fully understood it yet. The night finally began to wind down, not with a sudden stop, but with a gradual fading, the kind where conversations softened into murmurs and the once crowded room slowly emptied into the cool Manhattan air, leaving behind the faint scent of polished wood and expensive perfume. And Sophie moved through the final stretch of her shift with the same quiet focus she had carried all evening, stacking the last of the plates, wiping down tables that had already begun to lose their earlier shine, her body running on routine even as her mind drifted somewhere else, replaying moments she did not usually allow herself to dwell on, especially not during work. But tonight was different. Tonight something had shifted, even if she could not quite name it. And when she reached the table near the back again, the chair was empty, the worn coat gone, the glass cleared, as if he had never been there at all, except for one thing, something small and easily overlooked, resting neatly beside the folded napkin, her name tag, the same slightly scratched plastic piece she had been wearing all night. The pin bent just enough that it had slipped off somewhere between her last two tables without her noticing, and she paused, her hand hovering above it before she picked it up, turning it over slowly, her name printed in simple black letters, Sophie. Nothing more, nothing special, and yet the fact that he had noticed it, that he had taken the time to return it instead of leaving it lost on the floor like everything else that went unnoticed in a place like this, made something tighten quietly in her chest, not discomfort, not even surprise, just awareness. And tucked beneath it was a folded receipt, not a bill, just a blank slip from the register. And for a second she hesitated before opening it, her fingers smoothing the crease as she unfolded it carefully. And there, written in clean, deliberate handwriting, were just a few words, nothing dramatic, nothing extravagant. "You should not have to stand alone." And Sophie stared at it longer than she expected to, her eyes tracing each letter as if trying to understand why something so simple felt heavier than it should, because it was not a tip, not a transaction, not something she could categorize and move past. It was something else, something that did not belong to the routine she had built her life around. And she let out a slow breath, folding the receipt again, smaller this time, before slipping it into the pocket of her apron without thinking too much about it, because thinking too much had never helped her before. And across the room, her manager's voice called out instructions for closing, pulling her back into the rhythm she knew, the one that kept everything in place. And she finished the last of her tasks, clocked out with a quiet swipe of her card, and stepped outside into the cool night air, the city stretching endlessly around her, loud and indifferent and alive in a way that never paused for anyone. And she adjusted her jacket slightly, the thin fabric barely enough against the chill, before starting the familiar walk toward the subway, her mind already shifting toward everything waiting for her tomorrow, the rent, the second job, the endless list of things that did not solve themselves. And yet, as she reached the corner and paused for the light to change, Her fingers brushed lightly against the folded receipt in her pocket, and for just a second, she felt that same quiet awareness again, that something had changed, not in the world around her, not yet, but somewhere smaller, somewhere internal, like a single step taken in a direction she had not planned, and she did not know it, could not possibly know it, but somewhere not too far away, in a car that did not match the worn coat he had left behind, Ethan Blake sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the city passing by outside his window, the faintest trace of a smile returning, not because of what had already happened, but because of what he now intended to do next. The next morning did not feel like a fresh start. It rarely did for Sophie, because mornings were not about new beginnings, but about continuing what had never really stopped. The same alarm at 6:30, the same cramped apartment where the radiator clicked louder than it warmed, the same stack of unopened envelopes sitting on the small kitchen table like quiet reminders she could not afford to ignore forever. And she moved through it all with practiced efficiency, tying her hair back, pulling on the same worn jacket, grabbing a quick cup of coffee that tasted more like necessity than comfort. And for a moment, just a brief moment, her hand paused near her apron hanging by the door, her fingers brushing against the folded receipt still tucked safely inside, and she hesitated, not long enough to change anything, just long enough to feel it again, that strange sense that something small had shifted, before she shook it off and stepped out into the cool morning air, the city already awake, already demanding, already moving faster than she could keep up with if she stopped even for a second. And by the time she reached her second job, a small corner cafe that smelled of fresh bread and overworked espresso machines, she had pushed the thought aside, replaced it with orders, customers, the steady rhythm of survival that left little room for reflection, and hours passed the way they always did, one order blending into the next, until the bell above the door chimed again, soft, but distinct, and without looking up, Sophie called out the usual greeting, her hands already moving to prepare the next drink. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" And then she looked up, and there he was, not in the worn coat this time, not blending into the background the way he had the night before, but still somehow the same, standing there with that calm, observant expression, like he had been expecting this moment in a way she had not. And for a second, just a second, her composure slipped, not visibly enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel it, that flicker of recognition, of curiosity she had not planned for, and she straightened slightly, grounding herself again in the role she understood. "You found your way to a cheaper menu," she said, a hint of dry humor slipping into her voice before she could stop it, and he almost smiled, not fully, just enough to acknowledge it. "I was hoping the service would be just as honest," he replied, and something about the way he said it, light but intentional, made her pause for a fraction longer than necessary, because it did not feel like a coincidence anymore. It felt like a choice, and she studied him for a moment, not suspicious, not defensive, just aware. "We do our best," she answered simply, turning to start his order without waiting for him to elaborate, because that was easier, safer, and yet she could feel it, his presence lingering in a way that was not demanding but deliberate, like he was not here for coffee at all, like there was something else unfolding just beneath the surface that she could not quite see yet. And as she placed the cup in front of him, the steam rising between them, he reached into his pocket again, slower this time, more intentional, and instead of money, he placed something else on the counter, a small, neatly folded card, and slid it toward her with the same quiet precision. And Sophie glanced at it briefly before looking back at him, her expression questioning without words, and he met her gaze steadily, his voice calm, but carrying a weight she could not ignore. "You said right is right," he said. "I wanted to see if you meant it outside of last night." And for the first time since this started, Sophie felt the situation shift into something she could not easily categorize, not a transaction, not a simple interaction, but something closer to a test. And her fingers hovered just above the card, not touching it yet, because instinct told her that whatever was written inside would matter, more than a receipt, more than a tip, more than anything she had been offered in a long time. And the question was no longer about him, or even about the moment itself, but about her, about whether she would stay the same when it would be easier not to. And slowly, carefully, she reached for the card. Sophie's fingers closed around the edge of the card, the paper thicker than anything she usually handled, smooth in a way that felt deliberate, like it was meant to be noticed, and for a second she did not open it, not because she was afraid, but because something in her told her that once she did, things would not go back to being simple, and she had built her life around simple, around predictable, around knowing exactly what each day would demand from her and what she could give in return. And yet here she was, standing behind a cafe counter with a man who clearly did not belong to either of her worlds, holding something that felt like a turning point disguised as a piece of cardstock. And slowly, she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the clean, minimal print, the name at the top catching her attention first, Ethan Blake, followed by a title that made her breath pause just slightly, Chief Executive Officer, Blake Holdings. And for a moment, the noise of the cafe faded into the background, the low hum of machines and conversations blurring into something distant as the words settled into place, not dramatically, not with shock, but with a quiet, undeniable weight, because she understood what it meant, even if she did not fully grasp the scale of it yet. And when she looked up, he was watching her, not with arrogance, not with expectation, but with a calm patience that somehow made it harder, not easier, to react. And Sophie closed the card carefully, her fingers pressing along the fold as if grounding herself back into the moment, her expression steady but her thoughts moving faster than she wanted them to, replaying every interaction from the night before, every word she had said, every line she had refused to cross. And suddenly, the question shifted. It was no longer about whether she had been right, but about whether she had been tested. And she met his gaze again, this time with something sharper beneath the surface, not fear, not awe, but clarity. "So that was it," she said quietly, her voice controlled but carrying a weight that matched his earlier tone. "You were testing me." And he did not deny it, did not soften it. He simply nodded once. "I was trying to understand you," he replied, and something about that answer made her chest tighten, not because it was harsh, but because it was honest in a way she did not expect. And she let out a small breath, shaking her head slightly as she placed the card back on the counter between them, not keeping it, not throwing it away, just returning it to where it started. "You could have just asked," she said, and for the first time, there was a trace of frustration in her voice, not loud, not uncontrolled, but real, because to her, this was not a game, not something to be observed from a distance and analyzed. It was her life, her choices, her consequences, and Ethan seemed to understand that, or at least he recognized it, because his expression shifted just enough to show it. The calm still there but now layered with something more thoughtful, more careful. "Would you have answered honestly?" he asked, and the question lingered between them, not accusatory, not defensive, just open, and Sophie held his gaze, considering it for a second before answering. "I did," she said, her voice steady again. "You just did not trust it," and that landed not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, because it exposed something he had not said out loud, something he had not fully admitted even to himself. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with a different kind of tension now, not conflict, but understanding. And then Sophie reached for the card again, this time not to examine it, but to slide it back toward him completely, her decision clear before she even put it into words. "I do not need this," she said. Not dismissive, not proud, just certain. "Whatever you are offering, whatever this is supposed to be, I am not interested if it comes from a test." And the statement was simple, but it carried everything she had stood for the night before, everything she had repeated to herself just to keep going. And for the first time since he walked in, Ethan did not respond immediately, because this was not the reaction most people would have given him, not the acceptance, not the gratitude, not even the hesitation. It was a refusal, clear and unshaken. And as he looked at her, really looked at her again, he realized that this was the moment that mattered, not the argument, not the reveal, but this, the point where she chose herself over opportunity. And somewhere beneath his calm exterior, something shifted again, something he had not planned for, and Sophie turned slightly, already moving back into her work, because for her, the conversation was over, but for him, it had only just begun. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as Ethan stepped out into the late morning light. But this time, he did not pause, did not look back, not because the conversation had ended, but because he knew staying would not change what had just happened. And inside, Sophie continued moving through her shift as if nothing had shifted, her hands steady as she wiped down the counter, took the next order, smiled politely when required. But beneath that routine, something lingered, not doubt, not regret, but a quiet tension that had not been there before, because turning down opportunity was one thing, but turning down something she did not fully understand, something that might have changed everything, that was different, and she pushed it aside the same way she pushed everything else aside, focusing on what she could control, what she could finish before the next hour, the next bill, the next responsibility. And yet, every now and then, her mind drifted back to the look in his eyes. Not offended, not surprised, but thoughtful, like he had expected resistance but not rejection, and the distinction mattered more than she wanted to admit. And hours later, when her shift finally ended and she stepped back out into the city, the air slightly warmer now, the streets louder, more alive, she let out a breath she had been holding longer than she realized, her shoulders relaxing just enough to feel the weight she carried again, and she started her walk toward the subway, the familiar route guiding her steps without thought, until she reached the corner where a large digital screen flickered above the street, cycling through ads and news headlines, the kind most people ignored. But something made her glance up this time, just for a second, and that was all it took, because there he was, not in a worn coat, not sitting quietly in the corner of a restaurant, but standing confidently in a tailored suit, his name displayed in bold letters beneath him, Ethan Blake, the headline reading something about a major corporate decision, a shift in company policy, something about employee fairness and internal reform, and Sophie stopped walking without realizing it, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the image, the contrast so sharp it almost felt unreal, and suddenly, everything clicked into place, not gradually, but all at once. The calm demeanor, the way he observed instead of reacted, the deliberate questions, the test, all of it. And she let out a small, almost disbelieving breath, not because she had not believed the card, but because seeing it like this, in her world, in a place where she could not ignore it, made it real in a way that a piece of paper never could. And for a moment, just a moment, she wondered if she had made a mistake, if saying no had been the wrong choice, if pride had cost her something she could not get back. But the thought did not stay long, because, just as quickly, something steadier replaced it, the same thing that had guided her the night before, the same thing that had made her stand her ground in a room full of people who expected her not to. And she shook her head slightly, almost to herself, as if clearing the doubt before it could settle, because no matter who he was, no matter what he could offer, the way it started still mattered. And as she turned away from the screen and continued walking, she did not notice the black car, parked just across the street, the tinted window lowering just slightly, just enough for Ethan to watch her as she walked away, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward the way she always did. And this time, there was no plan in his mind, no structured test, no controlled environment, just a realization, quiet but undeniable, that if he wanted to understand her, if he wanted to be part of her world in any real way, he would have to step into it without the advantage he had always relied on. And for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty did not feel like a risk. It felt like the only honest choice left. The next few days did not bring anything dramatic, no sudden encounters, no unexpected messages, just the steady rhythm of Sophie's life continuing exactly as it always had. Early mornings, long shifts, quiet walks home under city lights that never seemed to dim, and yet beneath that routine, something subtle had changed, not in what she did, but in how she noticed things, the small details she used to overlook, like the way customers treated each other when they thought no one was paying attention, or how easily people accepted what was convenient over what was right. And she found herself thinking about that more than she expected, not about him specifically, but about the choice she had made, the line she had drawn, and whether she would draw it again if given the chance. And each time the answer came the same, steady and certain, even if it cost her. And across the city, in a world that operated on a completely different scale, Ethan sat at the head of a long conference table, the room lined with glass and steel, the skyline stretching behind him like a reminder of everything he had built. And yet his focus was not on the projections being presented or the numbers that once defined his decisions. but on something far simpler, a sentence that had refused to leave his mind. Right is right, even if you stand alone, and it echoed in a way that numbers never could, because it did not ask for strategy or analysis. It asked for alignment, for action, for change that could not be justified by profit alone. And when one of his executives began to explain why a certain policy had been overlooked, why fairness could not always be applied equally, Ethan raised his hand slightly, not interrupting loudly, just enough to shift the room's attention. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm control as always, but there was something different beneath it, something more grounded. Then we changed the policy, he said simply, and the room went still, not because the decision was impossible, but because it was unexpected, because it was not how things had been done before, and one by one, objections began to surface, carefully worded, professionally framed, explaining risks, costs, implications, all the reasons why maintaining the current system made more sense. And Ethan listened, not dismissing them, not shutting them down. But when they finished, he leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. If the system only works when it benefits us, then it does not work, he said, and there was no argument that could easily counter that, not without exposing something deeper, something most of them were not willing to confront, and for the first time in a long time. The decisions being made in that room were not just about growth or control, they were about something else, something that had started in a place none of them would ever expect. And later that evening, as Sophie stepped out of the cafe after another long shift, adjusting her jacket against the cooling air, she did not know that somewhere in the city, policies were shifting because of words she had spoken without expectation, without intention of being heard beyond a single moment. And as she walked down the familiar street, passing the same storefronts, the same flickering lights, she slowed slightly when she noticed something different. A small sign taped neatly to the window of a nearby restaurant. Simple, almost easy to miss, but clear, fair service policy in effect. And she paused for just a second, reading it again, not because it was directly connected, not because she could prove anything, but because something about it felt familiar, like an echo of a conversation that had not really ended. And as she continued walking, her steps steady, her mind quiet, she did not realize that the line she had drawn had not only defined her, it had started to reshape something much bigger. And somewhere behind that quiet shift, Ethan Blake was already preparing to step back into her world again, this time without a test, without a disguise, but with something far more difficult, the intention to earn what could never be given freely. The evening air carried a quiet kind of stillness as Sophie stepped out of the cafe once more, the city lights reflecting off the pavement like 1,000 small reminders that life kept moving, whether you were ready or not. And she adjusted her bag on her shoulder, her steps steady, familiar, grounded in a routine she had come to rely on, until she saw him again, not across a crowded room this time, not hidden behind a worn coat or a quiet observation, but standing there on the sidewalk just outside the cafe, no disguise, no distance, just Ethan, dressed simply but unmistakably himself. And for a moment, she stopped, not surprised exactly, but not unaffected either, because this felt different, not like a coincidence, not like a test, but like a decision. And he did not approach immediately, did not interrupt her path. He simply stood there, giving her the space to choose whether this moment would happen at all. And after a second, she walked toward him, not hurried, not hesitant, just present, her gaze steady as she stopped a few feet away, the city noise fading slightly between them. "You came back," she said, her voice calm, not questioning, just acknowledging, and he nodded, a small movement that carried more weight than words, without a test this time. He replied, and there was no trace of performance in it, no hidden layer, just honesty. And Sophie studied him for a moment, not looking for status, not looking for power, just looking for truth, the same way she had in every moment before. And something in his posture, in the way he stood there without expectation, without assumption, told her that this was not the same man who had walked into that restaurant days ago. And he reached into his pocket, slower than before, more deliberate, and instead of a business card or a folded note, he held out something small, something simple, her name tag, the same one he had returned before, now carefully placed in a clear protective sleeve, the scratches still visible, the bent pin still there, but preserved, respected, and Sophie's eyes flickered down to it, then back up to him. A question forming without words, and he answered it quietly. You said right is right, he said. I realized I have been building a world where that only applies when it is convenient. And he paused for a second, not for effect, but to make sure what he said next mattered. I am trying to change that, starting with myself. And there was no grand promise in it. No sweeping declaration, just a simple commitment. Grounded and real. And Sophie felt something shift again. Not the kind of shift that came from opportunity or advantage, but the kind that came from recognition, from seeing someone choose to meet her where she stood instead of asking her to move. And she reached out slowly, taking the name tag from his hand, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the sleeve. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because this was not about winning or losing anymore, not about who had been right or wrong. It was about what came after. And Sophie let out a small breath, her expression softening just slightly, not into certainty, not into surrender, but into possibility. This is not something you fix overnight, she said, her voice steady but quieter now. And Ethan nodded, not arguing, not rushing. I know, he replied. That is why I am here. And the simplicity of that answer lingered between them, honest in a way that did not need to prove itself. And Sophie looked at him for a second, longer before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod of her own. Not a full answer, not a final decision, but enough to allow something new to begin. And as they stood there, side by side on a city sidewalk where neither of their worlds fully defined them anymore, the distance that had